My name is Peter Coleman, and I am on faculty here, and I direct the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and I co-chair the consortium that sponsored this day as events with Beth Fisher-Yoshida. And I want to say that we're here to celebrate several things today. I'm not supposed to say we're here to celebrate the election, but I am going to say it just because what the hell, right? But this has been a day-long event that really was the brainchild of Christiana Gazzi, who is sighing a big sigh of relief that we're at the end of the day, particularly because it happened during our second major storm in a week. But thank you all for coming. You get big points for coming out in this weather. So we're here to celebrate the culmination of this day on Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Sustaining Peace, which many of you contributed and did sessions, and thank you all for, I was able to attend a couple of the sessions and they were fantastic, so hopefully you were able to take advantage of those. And we're also here to celebrate the launch of a book that I'll talk to. There's several of the contributors to this book are here as well. And it's a book called The Psychological Components of Sustainable Peace. And I'll give you a little context for where this book came from, where the idea came from. And then what I hope to do for about 15, 20 minutes is just provoke you, have some opportunities that I want to put forth to just provoke some conversation. Then I'm going to ask some of the contributors to come up and either respond or take questions so that we can just talk about this thing called peace, which I'm going to suggest we really don't know much about. This book was part of, so there's a bunch of chairs over here if you want to come across. It might be better to sit. This book was born of a meeting about almost 3 years ago now that we held at the Earth Institute, and it was co-chaired by Jeff Sachs and a physician named Gary Belkin and myself. And we, at the time, called together a kind of high-level group of scholars and UN folks and NGO folks who work in peace and conflict with the objective of trying to move the conversation from a focus of conflict prevention, violence prevention, war mitigation, to a conversation of peace. So we had a day-long meeting, a lot of big shots were there, and we found that that didn't really happen. It was very difficult to get people to change the channel. That many of us, including myself and many of you, have spent our lives thinking about peace in a very particular way, which is really the mitigation of bad things. And so we focus on problems like conflict. And it was very difficult to get the conversation to move in a different direction. So after this day-long meeting where what we had hoped to happen didn't happen, Mort Deutsch, who is my mentor, the mentor of several of you, and who unfortunately can't be here tonight because he, A, it's storming out, B, he's 94, and C, his wife took a fall this week, and so he's been in the hospital with her all week, so he's exhausted. So he can't come, he sends his regrets. He was going to come until the last minute, and then he just said, I can't do it. So Mort, who I've stolen every idea I could possibly steal from, approached me at the end of this day-long meeting and said, okay, so let's start with psychology. So obviously whatever peace is, if we're going to ever understand it in a comprehensive way, isn't just psychology, it has a lot of different dimensions, right? Peace has an economic dimension, it has to have a structural dimension, educational dimensions. There are a lot of important ways to approach it. But let's start with psychology, and let's challenge a group of psychologists to think about what are the basic components, psychological components of a sustainable peace. And so that's really where this thing was born, was Mort's suggestion that we start somewhere and try to see what we could identify as either currently being studied that's relevant to sustainable peace, or to establish a research agenda for the future to do the same. So that's the book. Now, what I'm suggesting here tonight is that what if we took peace seriously and really studied it and worked with it directly, not as an artifact of conflict, not in the context of war, but really as a phenomenon in and of itself, because what we'll suggest is that's a critical way to understand what peace is, okay? But I'm also going to suggest that because peace always happens with human beings, and human beings are complicated and communities are complicated, that I think we have to stop thinking about making peace happen and going into a situation and creating peace, that's really not how it works. But that we can think about some of the things that we can do to kind of increase the probabilities that communities will become and perhaps remain peaceful, and decrease the probabilities that they'll get stuck in destructive dynamics. So I want to encourage us to think about probabilities, not about us making change, because I think that's a fantasy. Okay, so let me talk about what I call 10 opportunities. So we know a lot about why in conflict zones it's very difficult to create peace, to make peace happen. There are many obstacles that we're aware of. But I don't want to focus on those. I want to focus on what I think are opportunities for systematically approaching peace. So here are 10. So one is just to study it. And what I'll suggest is that we don't. I know of one scholar who really studies peace, his name is Doug Fry. He's an anthropologist. He's actually an American, but he lives in Finland. And he studies peaceful societies. And he set out years ago to really say, you know, we don't really understand the conditions for peace. So let's, and we assume that societies, people are competitive and territorial, and that we're warmongers at heart. He really set out to dispel that myth and studied and found, I think, 88 internally peaceful societies and something like 77 regionally peaceful societies who practice, live in a certain manner that is peaceful. And he uses that data to not only debunk the myths that we are innately warlike, but also to see, well, what are the shared conditions? Are there some fundamental things that these societies share that we can glean insights from in order to better understand this thing that we call peace, right? So what I'm going to suggest is that we start to study peace directly. There's a historian named Jeffrey Blaine who says that for every 1,000 pages written on the causes of war, there's less than one written on the causes of peace. And so what I'm going to encourage those of you who are students and scholars and engaging in this area is that we start to take that seriously. So there's a couple of cautionary tales which speak to the importance of studying it directly. So one is a tale about a guy named John Gottman who studies marital conflict. Are people familiar a little bit with John Gottman's work? So Gottman is a mathematician and a counseling psychologist, and he and his spouse and his team in Seattle have studied marriage and divorce for probably about 30 years now. And they have a lab there they call the Love Lab, and they bring in thousands of couples, and they study their conflict dynamics. And typically what they say is, okay, so we want you to talk to each other for an hour about something conflictual, and usually it's sex or money, because that's why we fight, right? And so they talk about an hour, and then they code their emotional experiences, and from that, they're able to predict within 97% accuracy. So they look at that hour tape of their interaction, and they code the emotional dynamics. And they can predict within 97% whether that couple will be divorced or not in 5 years, which is terrifying, right, that they can actually do that. But it's a pretty robust model, but that's not the point. The point is that they worked for about 15 years with a multidisciplinary team to study marital dynamics, create this very simple mathematical model that was highly predictive. But they realized after about 15 years of work, come on in. Oh, good. Come on in, have a seat. They realized after 15 years of study of marriage and divorce that they could predict very well whether couples would be divorced or not, but they could not predict whether they would be happy. That their model did not predict happiness. That the opposite of divorce was not happiness. In fact, there were divorced couples who, in fact, were very friendly and lovely towards each other, and there were married couples who were miserable, right? But they weren't divorced, but they were miserable, right? So what they realized is that they had to start over and go back and study couples that were happy with each other and were thriving in the presence of each other. And so they took another 10, 12 years to study, happy couples before they had a more comprehensive sense of not just what predicts the lack of the negative or divorce, but also what predicts happiness, right? Well, we think something along the same thing is true with peace. So we've been doing a study, my research group, many of them are here, have been doing a study in Israel-Palestine for almost a year now. We've done about a dozen studies in the occupied territories in Israel. And we're trying to understand the motives, the basic things that drive people, A, either to really want the conflict to end and support negotiations to end it, or B, to really want improved relations between the communities and lasting peace. And one of the most interesting things we found in these dozen or so studies so far is that the motives for wanting the conflict to end versus the motives for wanting to work for peace are completely uncorrelated. They're different animals. They're not opposites, they just have no relationship to each other, right? So the reasons why people want conflict to end are fundamentally different from the reasons why people will agree to work to make better relations and lasting peace, okay? So like Gottman, we think that we have to really take peace seriously and understand this thing that we call peace in a way that gives it its due, right? That sort of respects this phenomenon, this animal that we call peace, in a way that we haven't, and pay much more attention to it. Are, again, sort of two different things. About half the population are really motivated to work for peace because of the pain of the conflict, right? The death, the destruction, the problems with the economy, the consequences of the conflict are what really motivate them to want peace. And they don't want to hear about working together and cooperation and all that crap. That just turns them off. They really want peace because they're in pain. The other half of the population are the reverse. There are people who are really motivated by the possibility of actually working together in collaborative ways and creating good things, and they hate the messages around pain and death and suffering. They don't want to hear about that. So if we hadn't started to study peace, we wouldn't realize that there are these really different things operating fundamentally to motivate people regarding peace. And we have some implications of that research that I can talk about. Okay, so point number one is we've got to study this thing. We have to study it directly. We can't just study it in the context of conflict, so we shan't. So the second point that I want to make, the second opportunity I'm going to suggest is that we maybe talk to some women. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I've noticed that if you look at incidents of gun violence, of war, of atrocities, most of the time it's mostly men doing this stuff. And women typically are cleaning up the mess afterwards, or creating mitigating conditions in the community that buffer against these experiences. But if you look at the international community or peace processes, typically women are largely missing. So the UN in the last couple of years have been organizing to make recommendations about how the UN should mediate and what is good mediation. And one of the main things that they argue for is the need to involve women in peace processes like mediation more. So they put out a set of guidelines for that, and then they held a big thing, a big nation-state sort of presentation of this in the spring, and they had a big panel, several, probably 10, 12 people on the panel, talking about the importance of women involved in mediation processes, and nobody on the panel was a woman. It was a group of 10, 12 men talking about the importance of women in peace processes, which I thought was really very interesting, right? So, and this, of course, parallels what often happens in communities. Now, the good news is that last year the Nobel Committee said, okay, well, maybe we should recognize a few women. So they recognized Ellen Sharif Johnson, they recognized Lema Bowie, and they recognized a Yemeni activist as three women who have been doing really more or less bottom-up peace processes, except for the president of Liberia, who of course is the first woman president of an African nation. But they began, they've at least symbolically recognized that group. But the importance of that can't be overstated. I think the importance of understanding what women do and can't do. There's a fantastic movement that's been out which is connected to the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell. So Pray the Devil Back to Hell is a film about Lema Bowie, who is one of the Nobel laureates, and her work in Liberia as a woman doing grassroots work. And one of the great things about not only the film, but what they've done with the film is that they've taken it to conflict zones around the world and shown it to groups of women to say, this is what happened in Liberia. Could something like that happen here? What might happen here? How would it be different? How might it be similar? To really start to raise consciousness about the possibility of direct women action. So one of the things that we're going to call for in the future actually is to start a new program which we hope to house at AC4, which is a program on peace, women, peace, and security. And we're hoping to attract Lema Bowie to come here, but we're about $5 million between that idea and the realization of it. So, but we'll pass a hat around later. Maybe we'll get started. Okay, 3. Learn that peace is both local and generalizable. So the anthropologists here, like Jeff, will know that there's a basic tension whether or not science can give us general principles of what peace looks like, or whether peace is just a different thing at every place you go. And people typically who work on the ground say peace is local. What it means in one community is not the same thing it means in another community, and you do a disservice to the community if you claim that, right? But scientists like Doug Fry, who studies peaceful societies, believes that if you step back enough, you can say, well, all peaceful societies have taboos against violence. Now, it might be that that looks very different in a community in Norway than it looks like in a community in Liberia or West Africa. But the taboos are there, and the taboos are real, and they're an important constellation. So we can learn from the study of societies at a general level, but locally we have to really respect that those things may look fundamentally different, right? Okay, next. There's a big crisis in the field of peace and conflict right now about the lack of effect of what we do. That there are many, many programs, dialogue programs, conflict resolution programs, violence prevention programs in schools, in communities, in warring nations, and it's very difficult to see how any of those programs at the local level have an effect at the national level, right? How what they call peace writ little affects peace writ large. We don't really know if that happens, when it happens, why it happens. So it's a critical area of study. There are areas of research that study what they call micro and macro processes and how things that happen at a local level can become contagious and affect higher levels. But the truth is we know very little about it. There are interesting case studies, such as case studies in Mozambique, in South Africa, a little bit in Northern Ireland perhaps, where programs have had that kind of impact. And we could study how and why. And we think this is a critical thing because otherwise it's really hard to make a case that what we do matters, right? If we can't see the impact accumulate somehow for peace writ large. Okay. Measurement and measurables. So one of the big problems of how we work is that when we try to evaluate or assess peace writ large or something that we're trying, impact that we're trying to have, we focus on the obvious. We measure the things we can see. And typically, how do social scientists measure outcomes? Either through observational data, like counting casualties, or surveys, right? Survey data. We talk to people. And the only problem with surveys is, my colleague Larry Leibovich, who's a mathematician, we were about to set up a 5-year longitudinal survey study in Israel, and he said to me, do you have any sense that if you ask people what's important to them around peace and conflict, they can tell you? And I said, no, but that's what we do. We survey people and they tell us what they think. And he then said to us, well, you need to talk to our colleague Howard Moskowitz, who is someone that transformed the food industry by not using surveys and not using focus groups. Howard realizes that when you ask people things like what kind of coffee you like, they tell you what they think they should say because they don't really know the difference. And so if we ask people, why would you work for peace, they don't really know if they haven't done it or thought about it systematically. So how we measure the outcomes and how we measure the effects and how we get to an understanding of peace it's critical that we, A, find more sophisticated and nuanced ways of assessing what's important to people. But B, that we not just measure the obvious. One of the consequences or critiques of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN has been that the things that they measure miss so much, right? It misses what informal groups or NGOs are doing on the ground or what youth and women are doing on the ground. It misses all of that because it doesn't measure it. They're hard to measure, but it is a challenge to us if we're going to really understand this animal called peace, that we, A, be able to understand what we need to measure, and B, we find new ways to measure it. Okay. 6, go beyond the, can anybody pronounce that word? Because I made it up. So if you look at, there has been a new attempt in the international community to create something called the Global Peace Index. Global? General Peace Index. The General Peace Index, is that right? What is it? John, what is it? Sorry? Global Peace Index. And this is a very sophisticated and important attempt to understand ways to, first of all, measure each nation state's on certain indicators around peace, and then to rank them and compare them. So every year they kind of put out a report that says, well, the Norwegian countries are up here, the US is way down here, and then these other countries are here, as a way to sort of name and shame people towards peace, right? And it's a fantastic initiative, but it's limited. So this year they launched something as a component of it called the Positive Peace Index, which is an attempt to recognize that the things that they were measuring, which was fear, basically, are not important enough, and that you have to measure things like schooling and good business and other components. But when I looked carefully at what actually they're measuring, they're still measuring problems. So they measure things like intergroup cohesion. Is there cohesion between interethnic groups? By, have you experienced crime from them? Or have you experienced discrimination from them? So we're not really measuring the positive aspects that can happen with intergroup connections. They're measuring the lack of the negative. So it's this attempt to measure peace and measure both negative and positive peace, or is a good direction, is a promising direction, but it's still very limited, and part of it is because of our disciplinary assumptions. A lot of the indicators are more economic-like indicators, which is an artifact of who created this measure. And so it really requires that psychologists get in the game, but other disciplines as well. Because as we suggest, peace is not an economic thing alone. It's not a psychological thing alone. It requires different points of view and having a better sense of a holistic approach. Okay? Another critique of the Millennium Development Goals is that when you establish goals for communities to achieve development goals, for example, or goals around peace, they have been basically establishing static goals and not realizing that A, different countries start in different places, and B, what matters most is progress. What we find in research in organizations, for example, is that it's more important to people that they feel that there is a fair sense of process and movement towards their goals than it is that they have what they consider sort of equal outcomes. They want to feel like this is a fair deal and that we're moving in the right direction. That's what matters, and so that's really what we should measure as an indicator of success, not whether they achieved a certain status, but whether they're moving there sufficiently. Educate for negative, positive, and promotive peace. So in our schools, we have these oftentimes disconnected areas. Betty Reardon, are you here, Betty? Betty's not here. Betty's a contributor to the book. Betty's given her life to creating peace education. And peace education is really an attempt to deconstruct militarism and sexism and racism and negative components that are part of the culture of war. And in schools to sort of really recognize that and deconstruct that. Critical component. But it's unconnected to other things like violence prevention or conflict resolution and pro-social activities, emotional learning and things like that. And what we need to do is have a more holistic sense of what kids need and see how they relate to each other. Not pit each other against each other, which is what we tend to do in this field, is, you know, fight for scarce resources, right? And claim that it's really about conflict resolution. But the truth is, they're all necessary. We're proposing to establish sustainable peace goals for progress at local, national, and international level. Again, very similar to the the Millennium Development Goals, which are now called the Sustainable Development Goals, which again have been very constructive in the international community for helping identify, prioritize certain goals, move people towards concrete action, create a comprehensive framework so people can start to coordinate across different sectors. There's been a lot of value. There's also been a lot of critique and limitations to the approach to the Millennium Development Goals that we can learn from in the attempt to establish goals around peace. One of the things that's ironic is that the United Nations doesn't have goals for peace, doesn't establish national goals for peace. There's an agenda for peace, everything's about peace, but there isn't an explicit identification of either an end state or a series of processes that are required to get there, right? So we're calling for that. And then finally, increased engagement, the need to both name, shame, network, and celebrate. That in order to motivate nations, regional organizations, local communities to engage in the movement towards such types of goals, it's important not just to do what we tend to do, for example, in the human rights community or with the General Peace Index, the Global Peace Index, which is to sort of out people as to where they are. But it's also important to, A, share best practices, right? So if there are, what are the communities doing that are doing this well, and how does that translate at a local level? If this is what Lema Bowie has been attempting to do with this film, is really share a certain best practice and then have dialogues with women to show how that may translate locally for them. So to network in those ways and to really celebrate those countries, those NGOs, those localities that are effectively making this kind of progress. Okay, so these are my 10 opportunities as of today for taking peace seriously or increasing the probabilities for sustainable peace. Now, what I'd like to do is recognize some of the contributors to the book, ask them to come up, and then they can take your hard questions. Okay? That sound good? As I said earlier, the book, the contributions by these contributors were inspired by the belief that we need to reorient the conversation, we need to reorient to the study of peace directly, not as an artifact of war, but in and of itself, and to understand at least the psychological components of that. And these contributors have contributed to the book that we're celebrating tonight. And then I, laid out these 10 what I call opportunities for moving us in that direction. Right?
It's the activities that promote peace. The testimonials describe participants' repugnance for distributive injustice, evident in world hunger and armament spending. They argue in favor of distributive justice, operationalize the demand for fair allocation of societal resources to promote well-being, and the construction of a sustainable world supportive of all people and of human rights. And so I'll just skip ahead to the conclusion, but just to give you a sense of that, it was a summary of the testimonials. This chapter, it's getting hot in here again. This chapter describes the study of peace as cultural practice through the Case of the World March. It served as a fertile context for individuals, for groups, for institutions to engage in innovative forms of nonviolent participation and cooperation across national, ideological, generational, and ethnic borders. It enabled hundreds of thousands of individuals from around the world to take part, personally or virtually, on a collective set of mutual recognition and collaboration that widened the scope of justice to include new allies. to kindle new possibilities for constructive struggle for peace and justice. And third, it redistributed information in order to interrupt a false consensus on the inevitability of violence, militarism, and injustice. In these ways, the march opened broader landscapes of meaning, action, and possibility, in which people were hopeful and willing to strive, individually and collectively, to maximize justice and minimize violence, to sustain a positive peace. So it just concludes to say that the constructs that underlie our analytic framework, peace, justice, nonviolence, along with the analysis of case data, invite researchers to stay close to the experience of individuals as they work together in social movements to promote and sustain positive peace. This approach, in turn, prepares us to ask questions about how, in our hopes for justice, in our complex cultural contexts, and in the power structures that surround us, novel worlds of possibility can emerge. So that's the end. But I want to thank you very much for your attention to the chapter.
I'll speak a little bit about the chapter I wrote here, and it's Transforming Communication for Peace. So the basic premise is that we make our relationships in communication, and the quality of our communication impacts the quality of the relationships that we make. The quality of our relationships creates the quality of the social worlds we make. If you think about how you speak to somebody whom you're in conflict with as compared to somebody who you may be at peace with, probably there's a little bit of a difference in what you say and how you say it, the emotionality that goes with it, the body posture, and so on. So one particular communication theory that I look at is coordinated management of meaning. It's CMM for short, because that's a mouthful. Developed by two men, but enhanced by women. And the two men are Barnett Pierce and Vernon Cronin, and we're doing a lot of work in this area. In fact, there is CMM Institute, cmminstitute.net, if you want to look at it. And we're moving ahead to try to create better social worlds in the work that we do. In this particular chapter, I focus on different uses of dialogue. Dialogue is a word that in many parts of the world is used and abused and overused, and it's sort of lost some of its meaning because people use it in many different ways. Just as you say peace, people use it in many different ways, and what do they really mean? So I thought that to analyze something is really to break it apart, but in order to use it in practice, sometimes we have to break it down to simple parts so that we know how to even begin. What's the first thing we do after the next day when you wake up? What's the first thing you do? So there are three different approaches to dialogue, and it depends on how you think about dialogue. Do you think about it as a process that we do dialogue in a certain way, how we communicate? Do you think about it as an event, let's have a dialogue? Or do you think about it as the context or the content and what you're doing? So in the chapter, you can read more about the dialogue and different ways of doing it, and then it's interesting that the next chapter I'm writing actually is Transforming Communication for Conflict, and I thought actually that's maybe backwards, but I don't always work forwards, so I'm working backwards now too.
So should we go to questions, or would you like to make any brief comments?
I could say that my chapter is titled Fostering Global Citizenship. And perhaps I can describe to you my personal life, should I? I live globally since about 40 years. This year I have moved 30 times. I've lived in about 5 countries this year, and I do that every year. I do not have an apartment. I do not have a house. I do not have possessions. So I'm a global citizen. I have never met anybody who lives like me. If you are thinking of E.T., I'm coming close to E.T. And somehow it's the most holistic approach to peace, and in my work I use the word dignity, that you can imagine, because I invest my entire life into that. And the result is very interesting on many, many levels. I just ask you one question now to give you a feeling of how I feel on this planet. How do you feel when I ask you, should we treat our slaves kindly or not? What do you think? This is how I feel on this planet, surrounded by false choices. And it's a long story, and it's a very, very rich but also difficult to explain experience. However, it has also very, very many theoretical reverberations, which I try to explain in this chapter. I think that what I do is somehow the practice of passaging or transiting from the old motto of if you want peace, prepare for war. I think this was the motto during the past 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And this motto was inescapable for for everybody. And today I think we live in historical times of a window of opportunity where we can and have the possibility, if we really see it and use it, to make true what Gandhi said: peace is not the aim, peace is the path. And this is what I do practically in my life. And, from this ET perspective, I see the world very, very differently to 99% of the people I meet on this planet. And from this perspective, I must admit that I find Mort's and Peter's work to be extraordinary. They're extraordinary, free, unlimited thinkers who can think beyond categories. What is so important, I think, is to think beyond. And this is what you do. This is the courage you have. And there are very few people on this planet who are courageous and daring enough to do that. So I really would like to express my deep admiration for your work. And this is why I'm here. This is why I come here every year in November, December. I'm here in New York. And I would love to invite you to my book presentation, if I can make some advertisement. I will present my book. It is titled A Dignity Economy, on the 5th of December at the library here. And on the 6th and 7th of December, we will have our workshop on transforming humiliation and violent conflict in this room here. So you are all very warmly invited. Thank you.
I'll just say a couple of words about the chapter that I worked on with Mort and Sarah Brazaitis, which I believe in my conversations with Mort were stimulated by your chapter, Evelin. And it's about a framework for thinking about the development of a global community, in which sort of Mort outlines how psychological knowledge about groups and how groups develop and form and function in a healthy way can be brought to bear on developing a global community. And sort of as an outgrowth of that, without sort of going through what else is in the chapter, as an outgrowth of that, Mort and Jim Westerby and a few folks in here are part of a Global Communities Forum, which is trying to bring together different folks throughout the university, working on global issues, really, to bring to bear thinking in these different disciplines and increase the idea generation for how we can build a stronger global community. But I think Evelin sort of embodies what Mort is trying to write about on a theoretical level. Evelin embodies sort of in practice.
Here, I do not have an apartment. I do not have a house. I do not have possessions. So I'm a global citizen. I have never met anybody who lives like me. If you are thinking of ET, I'm coming close to ET. And somehow it's the most holistic approach to peace, and in my work I use the word dignity, that you can imagine, because I invest my entire life into that. And the result is very interesting on many, many levels. I just ask you one question now to give you a feeling of how I feel on this planet. How do you feel when I ask you, should we treat our slaves kindly or not? What do you think? This is how I feel on this planet, surrounded by false choices. And it's a long story, and it's a very, very rich but also difficult to explain experience. However, it has also very, very many theoretical reverberations, which I try to explain in this chapter. I think that what I do is somehow the practice of passaging or transiting from the old motto of, if you want peace, prepare for war. I think this was the motto during the past 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And this motto was inescapable for for everybody. And today, I think we live in historical times of a window of opportunity where we can and have the possibility, if we really see it and use it, to make true what Gandhi said: peace is not the aim, peace is the path. And this is what I do practically in my life. And from this ET perspective, I see the world very, very differently to 99% of the people I meet on this planet. And from this perspective, I must admit that I find Mort's and Peter's work to be extraordinary. They're extraordinary, free, unlimited thinkers who can think beyond categories. What is so important, I think, is to think beyond. And this is what you do. This is the courage you have. And there are very few people on this planet who are courageous and daring enough to do that. So I really would like to express my deep admiration for your work. And this is why I'm here. This is why I come here every year in November, December. I'm here in New York. And I would love to invite you to my book presentation, if I can make some advertisement. I will present my book. It is titled A Dignity Economy, on the 5th of December at the library here. And on the 6th and 7th of December, we will have our workshop on transforming humiliation and violent conflict in this room here. So you are all very warmly invited. Thank you.
I'll just say a couple of words about the chapter that I worked on with Mort and Sarah Brazaitis, which I believe in my conversations with Mort were stimulated by your chapter, Evelin. And it's about a framework for thinking about the development of a global community, in which sort of Mort outlines how psychological knowledge about groups and how groups develop and form and function in a healthy way can be brought to bear on developing a global community. And sort of as an outgrowth of that, without sort of going through what else is in the chapter, as an outgrowth of that, Mort and Jim Westerby and a few folks in here are part of a Global Communities Forum, which is trying to bring together different folks throughout the university, working on global issues, really, to bring to bear thinking in these different disciplines and increase the idea generation for how we can build a stronger global community. But I think Evelin sort of embodies what Mort is trying to write about on a theoretical level. Evelin embodies sort of in practice.
Thank you. I hope I'm not out of place, or on the contrary, I'm right on the money. But I mean, we are on a day after the scenario, and so any of you would like to comment on the perspectives, Palestine or Colombia, after Barack Hussein's fortunate election in my book, but I'm not so sure that he is really deserving the prize that prematurely got in 2009.
So is your question?
It's the perspectives for peace. Pick the place you want to take, either Colombia, but hey, as long as there is such thing as the war on drugs, I'm very skeptical of possibilities of real peace in my home country, or Palestine, or anywhere in the world. What you want to pick
So perspectives for peace.
after the re-election of Obama?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because I think it does focus more on the sober realities. If I had heard the victory speech, and during the whole debates, there was always talk of the might of America and we will win, and there was more talk of tanks, and it's still it's still the dialogue of militarism. And he did say that then we hope for peace, but it wasn't as well articulated as I mean, I don't know if others of you had heard his speech. I mean, I'm sure many people did. I heard it at 4 a.m. on YouTube. But I didn't want to stay up. But I felt that there needs to be a reshifting. And the work that I really love is from the Cold War. It's Osgood Susie Tannenbaum, was it? No, it was Osgood, though. It was Grit. Do people still teach Osgood? Yes. But yeah, it was those three, but it was only him, right? And it was the graduated reduction in tension through reciprocation. And I think people who are in conflict are going to have to learn they have to give a little and respect a little in order to get the other to reciprocate. And instead of having an arms race, you can have a kind of generosity race. But it's a different mindset that you can give a little bit. And it happens in interpersonal relations, but also it was developed internationally for the Cold War. And I think we have to start thinking about the ways that we have to just change the mindset of leaders. There's a tremendous investment in that equipment, and there's a whole industry connected to that. And so we're dealing with a world that's structured for war.
I was going to add something to that as well, and it's so overwhelming in some ways what you're asking. But I think that just as as Peter mentioned, that we know how to live in conflict and do conflict more than we know how to do peace, then we have to take maybe an appreciative approach to looking at where peace is working and what it's doing and grow that. And since I haven't had a shout out, I'm going to give a shout out to something we're working on. And there's something called Cosmopolis 2045, which is a web-based interactive site that will be launched a year from now. And we just asked a very simple question like, what if people communicated with each other in a way that was different from the way they communicate today? What if people communicated constructively? What if people really were able to engage in dialogue, still have conflicts, but work it out well? And one of the pavilions there is a pavilion for sustainable peace that I'm working on with a group of people, some of who are here. And also there's going to be another pavilion, I think it's called Democracy Hall. And the impetus for that is, if any of you have ever heard some of the campaign speeches, debates, and so on, what are people saying to what you've mentioned, Susan, as well? And we're going to rewrite some of these speeches so that people don't just say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to bash the other guy because I have bigger guns than he has or she has, but they're actually going to engage in dialogue using CMM as a way to have real conversations about the real issues that people are facing.
Any other comments you want to make?
On the UN, I worked on it from the NGO side as part of a psychological society. And it's the amount of knowledge and cooperation from volunteers, from societies working together is amazing. And it's as a forum for being able to bring people together, it's really, really important. The extent to what, is it effective? Well, probably some things are and some things aren't. But it's peace is an ongoing process. And so, people need to find new ways and new ways to work together. But I don't know if it didn't exist. I think we don't have a controlled planet, but things could be much worse. So I think we have to respect the forum as a forum for that things could happen.
Let's say one little thing about it. It's just so when the UN started, it had a certain goal, a certain mission, and then the world was a different place. And so now the world's a very different place. So you have a lot of good people with a lot of good talent who are in there having good intentions, and then you have a system that doesn't necessarily support that because the world has changed. So you have different levels. You have the individual and the group, and then you have the system. And so the system sometimes gets in the way of all the people trying to do good things. And then you have some people who are there for their own personal reasons, which don't necessarily help other people in the world. And then you have a lot of people feeling underappreciated. So that all layers together. But in pockets, I agree with Susan that there have been some really effective things that have been done and some things that could have been done better. For example, the first mission, the first peace mission in Israel, Palestine, is still there, and it was really, the goal was to dismantle it once they settled things. So that's just an example that sometimes things stay. So.
You know, from the perspective of somebody like me, I look, as I said, from a very, very great distance at this planet. And for me, one theoretical approach is quite interesting. This is the security dilemma that is embedded in a world when it is fragmented, in nations that might be hostile to each other. So from my point of view, the path that we as a human family on this planet, if we want to have peace in the future, have to go is to manifest that we are one family on one tiny planet. And how do we do that? It is important to weaken the security dilemma. It is important to, for example, see what Beth said, that individuals often are ahead of this transition and systems and structures are lagging behind because they are still in the past. So this is what we have here too. The UN, the system is basically a club of nations, like a golf club. Basically, it's nothing. But the people, many very, very, enthusiastic people are in there. And so what I have decided, therefore, is to look for the people and to build a global community of people rather than of institutions like nations or any other institutions. People, movements of people.
So please join us for some refreshments.